recording has started. I'm going to share screen. You guys should see my entire screen right now. Before I forget, I just wanted to let you guys know I uploaded this PDF. If you look on Canvas, you don't have to look at it, but if it's of interest, something I said last class, so on Monday, I think when we were talking about ACEs, I said, oh, there's actually like a questionnaire that's often used just to assess number of ACEs. And I said I might look for it, I might upload it. This is like really easy to find, but this is generally like a very brief question, like a screening questionnaire, basically to assess like how many ACEs has someone experienced in their life. And remember, ACEs are for childhood events, so it'll say specifically within the first 18 years of your life. So if you're interested, these are like kind of the examples of what would constitute an ACE, many of which are things like neglect and abuse that we were already discussing. But you might notice some other things that we didn't discuss but would constitute an ACE. So you can take a look at that. As far as like how it's used, people use it in different ways. It's not typically, to my knowledge, something that's used clinically. So if I were seeing, someone for maltreatment or well, really, if I were to see someone for trauma, I'm not really going to give an ACEs questionnaire unless I'm just curious about the different things in their environment. But as a clinician, I'm probably going to give more screeners as far as like psychopathology, like trauma related symptoms, things like that. So that's more of that's I think what I would do in a clinical capacity. Research wise is really where I see the ACEs being used most. So you might see some research on child maltreatment, and then they'll look at the number of ACEs that a child's been exposed to, and they might, look at it cross-sectionally with some other outcomes. So just thought I would show you, but yeah, you're not going to be tested on that or anything, but I thought it was interesting to show. Okay, so let's pick up where we left off from the PowerPoint. We are here today on Wednesday, and again, just a reminder for like the 5th time, we're meeting only today and then Friday. So 2 days from now is another flipped classroom that I had to add in like a few weeks ago. So we will not meet Friday, but just again, another reminder that assignment 4 is due this Sunday. And your assignment 3 grade should have already been released by now. Okay. I'm going to skip through all this because we did all that. We talked about so where we ended was we had already started to talk about this trauma and stressor related disorders broadly. And we started by just talking about what are some normative reactions in response to acute stress. So anytime there's a perceived trauma or stressor in the environment, what's the normal response that our body goes through? So we talked about that. And then we talked about when it kind of becomes problematic. So when we have prolonged stress, which could be the case in, let's say, if you're cumulatively exposed to many traumas or stressors in your life. So for example, ACEs, while some of those may not constitute trauma in the context of PTSD, but let's say an ACE, because those are a little bit more broad, cumulative exposure to ACEs is going to be an example of that prolonged stress response reaction, which is not very healthy for the body. The other time you'll see prolonged stress is when someone does develop PTSD. So it's this idea that, yes, it was normative for your body to respond, go in fight or flight, but the things that prolong the symptoms, so why you start seeing things like PTSD symptoms, which we'll talk about in a sec, is partly in reaction to having this prolonged period of your body being in such a stressful activation, so to speak. And then I had advised if you guys wanted to, like I'm explaining it broadly as far as like the bodily response, but there's clearly neurobiological changes, there's physiological changes that occur, and really in the context of PTSD. So I didn't cover this, but if it's of interest, the 2-minute video on the right is super helpful. And then I think we ended there. Yeah. So where we're going to start now is just covering the rest of the disorders in the section, and then you'll be done after today as far as like how much content I would like you to know for the exam in terms of the classifications of disorders. So the ones I think we'll pretty much talk about all of these except for acute stress disorder. And even then, adjustment disorder down here, I'll go through pretty quickly. So really, we'll spend most time talking about reactive attachment disorder, disinhibited social engagement disorder, and then post-traumatic stress disorder. I think those have the most relevance for our class, so we'll be spending the most time talking about those three. Okay, so I think this is really important just to establish from the start. We're going to talk about trauma generally, and we're going to talk about what it means to have criterion A, the PTSD diagnostic criteria met. So trauma in general, take it out of the PTSD context, just think about it broadly. So what a general definition would be is an event outside everyday experience that would be distressing to almost anyone. So this is a very broad, common definition. Now, how that differs, though, and this is where there's a lot of confusion, and I see a lot of like, I don't know, I think like colloquially, you'll see it online. I think there's a very alive and well mental health community online. I think something that can get confusing, though, is the terminology that's being used, because terminology gets used pretty liberally when it may not actually apply to a specific disorder. So in the context of a PTSD diagnosis, and we'll go through each criterion in a second, criterion A for PTSD is that you have to be exposed to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence through witnessing, indirectly learning, or repeated indirect exposure. Outside of this context, other trauma would not count for a diagnosis of PTSD, at least to meet criterion A, which you have to satisfy. So that can be really confusing for some people. I think when people colloquially, like let's say, for example, someone might be going through a really hard divorce, or they were treated really poorly at work. And so people will say, oh, that trauma, that was a traumatic event. That can be talked about globally. Like that could be very traumatic for that person. But as far as what warrants a PTSD diagnosis, that may not constitute criterion A for PTSD specifically. So some examples of the trauma that we might consider for a PTSD diagnosis, criterion A would be things like, I'm going to start from the bottom to top, just because I think we just talked about them. So these four down here, neglect, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, we just discussed that, right? Like that's an abuse context, especially for kids, we see that. So all of these things would constitute some sort of, so sexual violence, physical violence, serious injury, that would all be over here under physical and sexual. Serious injury, actual threatened death. So things like being someone who is involved in a war and seeing, so you can think of first responders, you can think of, obviously people think of veterans with PTSD, but if you yourself were someone who was in a war zone and you had to flee, like all of that would constitute natural disaster, terrorism. Also medical traumas could be something important that I think I always forget about this one, but it does constitute something that would warrant a PTSD diagnosis as far as what satisfies criterion A. So like serious illness or like an invasive procedure that like, so if you think of like a little kid who had to do, I don't know, something really invasive that can cause, that basically threatens death, that might count. Physical injury or accidents. So that may, if that threatens death, then that could be potentially one. School violence, so bullying, not necessarily, would be again for PTSD. Something like a school shooting, though, would. And so there's like a really fine, like, I think the unfortunate thing is that it has to be really severe escalation. I don't know if you can tell for a criterion A to be met in PTSD. Domestic violence, of course, that's going to fall under sexual violence, potentially, or actual or threatened death. If you're a child and you're witnessing domestic violence in your home, that can be satisfied for criterion A. And then kind of like I mentioned with the school shootings, community violence. So something like, again, witnessing, experiencing yourself some sort of actual or threatened death. Shootings, rapes, stabbings, beatings would all constitute that. So just hold this in your mind for now. We're going to talk about PTSD in a little bit, but I think just think about trauma like this broadly for the rest of the lecture, and we'll talk about the criteria in a bit. Oh, I thought I moved the slides around. Okay, I guess we'll do PTSD first. Sorry, I reorganized this in the pretty recently. Okay, so we'll do all of the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. So hold this in your mind. The PTSD diagnostic criteria is going to be the same for anyone 6 years and older. So it does count for kids. Now, if you're below 6 years, there's going to be a preschool subtype specifier, and there's going to be slight differences. So we'll talk about that last. But for anyone 6 and up, these are the diagnostic criteria that we're looking at. And just like major depressive disorder, where we said, again, here's all the general diagnostic criteria, but we can make some sort of exceptions for a child. So remember, we said for MDD, the child doesn't necessarily have to display depressed mood. We actually might see irritability more often, especially the younger that they are. So that was like a developmental consideration we made. There are certainly developmental considerations here, even for 6 years, little kids like 6 years old and above. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so criterion A, we already kind of started to talk about. That's the exposure to the actual stressor. So again, exposure to death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence through either direct exposure, you witnessed it yourself in person, indirectly, you've learned this through a close relative or a close friend, or there's repeated or extreme indirect exposure to aversive details of the event. So that's, think of like a first responder or I don't know, like a crime scene detective or something like that, where you're repeatedly working with these like photos or videos or something like that. That's what we mean by repeated or extreme indirect exposure. This is not the same as being a passive viewer, like someone who turns on the news and sees pictures of travesties, of course, but what we mean here by repeated or extreme direct exposure is that you explicitly are kind of being exposed in a way that would be more so than the general public would be. The caveat here, and this is why I presented the previous slide, is that it doesn't allow for just any stressful event to be considered trauma, no matter the subjective distress. So in general, we really want to think of this criterion, again, just for the PTSD diagnostic criteria. Think of it as threats to your life or threats to your limbs. So it's very circumscribed, and there's so that's just what it is right now. And I'll just add though that there's a lot of discussion in the field. And again, remember, if you're looking at all the different work groups, so I talked a lot about last week the personality disorder field, and I said this is where the field is moving. This is where all the researchers are really trying to get the DSM to move towards for the next iteration. Just the same, there are PTSD trauma work groups. There's the neurodevelopmental work group. So I'm pretty certain that in the PTSD trauma work group, there's been a lot of discussion about how do we account for other, like, is there room to expand the trauma definition, basically? And I know there's been conversation about how it leaves out things that have always been the case, but might be more prevalent or at least more acceptable in discussions now. So I've seen, for instance, like discussion about shouldn't like racism or discrimination or things that are very blatant and overt, like should those things not count as part of this criterion A broad definition overview? So I don't have an answer, but just to give you context, like I recognize this is very boxy and like very circumscribed. And I know that there's discussion about expanding it. And as of now, it's just not expansive. So I think this confuses a lot of people because the word trauma gets used very loosely. But as far as the PTSD diagnosis, there's very specific definitions about what counts for criterion A. And you need at least one exposure here, so one required. Criterion B, these are our intrusive symptom clusters. So criterion B is intrusive symptoms. It used to be called the re-experiencing symptoms, and that just gives you a sense of it's the things that intrude or permeate your like everyday your everyday present conscious lives. So you need at least one of these symptoms in order to be diagnosed with PTSD. So one of them could be recurrent involuntary and intrusive memories. It might be having traumatic nightmares. It could be dissociative reactions. So you might get flashbacks in the middle of the day or any waking moment. Intense or prolonged distress after exposures to reminders. So I'm going to talk about a case later, so keep this one in mind, but I can tell you now. So the girl that I worked with that I'm going to do a case study on later for you all, was in a car accident where, like, it was a fatal car accident. She, of course, is alive. I work with her, and her brother died in that car accident. So very traumatic. She was a child when it happened. She's now a teenager. So a potential reminder, for example, could be, um, every summer that she goes to visit family, there are some artifacts from the deceased brother that could remind her of her traumatic event. If she sees pictures from the car crash, like, that could be a reminder. It also doesn't have to be clear to us, right? It could be, a lot of times, like, visceral things like sense, like that could be a cue or a reminder, and that would take her a while to return to baseline. So that's that intense or prolonged distress after exposure. And then the other one is marked physiologic reactivity after exposure to trauma-related stimuli. So I kind of lump these together right now in my example, but if my client in this situation saw some sort of reminder or anything that feels trauma related, it's a stimuli associated with that, she probably would experience peak anxiety or like something really stressful. So she'll say that she feels dysregulated, and then that dysregulation is intense and it's prolonged. So for her, she meets like at least these two together all the time. Okay, those are the intrusive symptoms. The next cluster is criterion C, the avoidance symptom clusters. And I don't believe you have to get, I can double check this, but I believe you don't have to have a diagnosis, with one of these symptoms, which is different than the other ones, where you do have to have criterion A, you do have to have criterion B, you must have criterion D, at least two of them. But one of the other clusters that's pretty common in PTSD is avoidance, and that's exactly what it sounds like. It's effortful avoidance to not have to deal with the distressing feelings associated with the trauma. It can be, I'm cognitively trying to avoid, so I just push it down, or it can be I'm physically avoiding. So like again, I'm going to use my client as an example, refusing to drive, refusing to sit in the car, right? Like those kinds of things. Or again, because I said she goes home every summer where the event happened, refusing to go into like the same shopping plaza, like those avoidance behaviors are things that we are talking about here. And I'll also say that this avoidance is why, if you remember in the anxiety disorders chapter, I mentioned that PTSD and OCD used to all be collapsed under anxiety disorders in previous versions of the DSM. So definitely DSM-4. I don't think DSM-3, because that was the access system, but they used to be clumped under anxiety, and in part because of people thought there was some shared etiology, and of course there is, because your brain is your brain, and certain parts of your brain are going to be activated, and all of them feel like there's some sort of response to a stressor, and that stress is maintained. In this case, the avoidance and anxiety is maintained over time. So this avoidance cluster of PTSD, I think, is what people think looks most like anxiety. But again, this cluster alone would not explain PTSD, which is why it's a distinct and separate disorder from anxiety. That's why it's a different disorder. That's why it's in a different section of the DSM. And that's why PTSD is more closely related to some of the other disorders we're talking about today. But just a note, like if you're wondering, well, why was PTSD ever lumped with anxiety? It's really this avoidance cluster and some of the anatomic, like the brain stuff that we see with anxiety and avoidance. Okay. And then criterion D. So this is your negative cognitions and mood cluster. And it's really any negative changes to the way we think and then the way we feel, so our emotions. And here, two symptoms need to be endorsed by the person. So examples include inability to recall key features of the traumatic event. So that maps onto cognition. So it's very common for people to forget or to say they can't remember. And either of those could be true. It could be genuinely like, I cannot remember. I like have a lapse in memory, really hard for me to even say what happened. Other times it's kind of like perhaps like a defense mechanism. Maybe it is there, but it's been avoided for so long, it's really hard to kind of recall those details. Whatever the case is, that is some sort of negative alteration in our thoughts. And so that would count. Distorted or negative beliefs and expectations about oneself or the world. That's very similar to the next one, blaming yourself or others for causing the event or its resulting consequence. So this distorted negative beliefs, this one I'm pointing out right here, that one you see a lot of, this is where a lot of the like cognitive processing comes into play when we talk about trauma treatment, which we'll do, again, we'll talk about in a sec. A lot of this is not necessarily saying like that's a cognitive distortion, because it actually makes a lot of sense for someone who's been through something very traumatic, is experiencing clear, like current PTSD symptoms, to develop beliefs about the world. The world isn't safe. I was clearly put in a really unsafe situation. This was really terrible. So, of course, the feeling is that whatever, other people are unsafe, people are out to get me, or people are dangerous, things like that are very common beliefs. The idea is, again, not to say like that's not true, because in this context, it actually makes a lot of sense that that would be a belief formed. I think the cognitive processing in the example I gave would be, yes, and are you in a current situation, or does the rest of your life currently still look that dangerous? Or like, is there evidence to support that actually you're still in that danger situation, if that makes sense? So if we took someone who was in a, I don't know, like a war zone, and they had beliefs about the world is dangerous, constantly living in under threat, okay, and when they remove them from that situation and they're maybe in a different country or whatever, we still might just say like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I wonder, like, is it doing you any favors right now? Remember, we're thinking about that prolonged stress curve that we just talked about a few slides ago. Is this helpful? And sometimes it's not. A lot of times it's causing more distress. It's really, that's what's causing most of the distress currently. So I say all this because I think it's important to know that with like the cognitive side of therapy for this sort of trauma, it's not just about saying like, oh, that's a distortion, we should change that, right? And that's not to say that's what we do with anxiety or depression either, but I used those examples really loosely. I think here it's important to know that we do talk about how these things are often adaptive. It makes sense why if you were in a car accident, you were, of course, the vigilant and scanning. And the dialectic, the other side, is that your life is really stressful right now because your head is always on a swivel. And that may not be a way that you want to continue living life. So that's something we might do for the distorted negative beliefs. And then same thing with blaming self and others. I keep using the other example of like other people are not safe, but if you yourself blame or have the blame for whatever the event is, that also may not be helpful in the long run. And I think it's okay to feel, right? We would always say any emotion is valid. You feel how you feel, that's okay. And again, is that helpful to you? So if my client at the very, very beginning of her traumatic event, this had happened many, many years ago by the time I started seeing her. So she no longer holds this belief, but one of the beliefs she held was, it's my fault my brother died. Like, I told him to wear his seatbelt. He's younger than me. I'm the older sister. I have that responsibility. I failed as a sister. I failed culturally, like our values, that I take care of him. And so it's my fault. And that's, I think she was like 10 or 11 when this accident happened. That's a very hard thing to live with. And so a lot of the things she had to work through over time was that there's a behaviorally, when we think of the world of behaviorism, we always think of there's some stimuli in the environment that always is responsible for an outcome. So it's not actually her fault that he didn't put on his seatbelt. And even if it was, they were hit by a drunk driver. And so it's the drunk driver's fault, right? It's someone coming in. And also, he was a little kid and he probably should have been wearing a seatbelt. So I think all of these things can be true. And I think as far as treatment, it's really trying to restore balance for that person. Okay, these other ones, markedly diminished interest in the pre-traumatic significant activities that you used to enjoy. That's kind of similar to depression. So loss of interest in activities, feeling alienated from others, so feeling really alone, and then this should say, I think this should say constricted affect, so really restricted range of emotion. So while most people generally are pretty expansive, so you see like their eyes get wider, right, when they're a little bit more uplifted, and then when they're sad, you can tell that their mood goes down, like you see it reflected in their affect. So you would say that's congruent affect. When someone has more restricted affect, you're seeing less of that up and down, which is not typical for most people. Okay. But then we have criterion E, which is our hyperarousal or reactivity cluster. And again, you also need 2 symptoms to be endorsed here. So this includes things like hypervigilance, exaggerated startle response, irritability or aggressive behavior, being self-destructive or reckless, and then sleep disturbance. We're nearly always going to see sleep disturbance in most of these disorders, as Annika talked about before. So it's like a transdiagnostic risk factor that we see sleep always weaving in and out of the different disorders. This is pretty like classic when people think of veterans and you see this played out in movies. This is the cluster that almost always gets acted out. It's that like exaggerated, like very suspicious and paranoid behavior often is driven by this like because their body's also physiologically reactive to all the stimuli in this environment. So my client came in with a lot of hypervigilance symptoms. So she has different accommodations school-wise, and one of them, interesting, this was before I started working with her, is that she has like an accommodation to sit in the back of the class so that nothing is behind her. And that speaks to this hyperarousal like reactivity. It's really like disturbing for her to feel like there's people behind her. And so that's something that she got accommodated for class so that she can have an equal chance at learning than other people. Okay, and then as far as duration, criterion F, symptoms need to be present for more than a month. As always, functional impairment, and then we'll talk about the preschool subtype. So that was for everyone, 6 and up. You can also get a PTSD diagnosis with the preschool subtype specifier if you're under 6. And this is a little bit different in that rather than thinking of the main 4 symptom clusters, we kind of collapse 2 of them into one. So if we're looking at a child under 6, we still are going to look for criterion A, that there was an exposure. We still need at least 1 intrusive symptom, but criterion C and criterion D are now lumped into one. So you can have avoidance, you can have negative alteration in cognition or mood. Doesn't matter. Like we're clustering those together and you only need 1 symptom. So either you have avoidance or you have one of the negative alteration symptoms. That's different. If you remember criterion D for adults or 6 and up, you need 2 under the negative alterations category. And then criterion E, all alterations in arousal, so that hyper reactivity, the vigilance stuff, that is the same. The other thing is that just keeping in mind that they don't need to show extreme emotional distress at the time of the event or during the intrusive symptoms, which can make it a little bit, I think, hard for some people to detect PTSD in preschool age because it's not as common that you'll see this extreme level of emotional distress the way you might see in an adult. In general, so preschool or not, so just in the general child age range, most youth become upset at reminders of the trauma and they experience repetitive, intrusive thoughts about the event. So that's pretty consistent. A lot of times we see the child becomes maybe dependent on their caregiver or they have difficulty separating. As far as like some of the cognitions, like in anxiety, they might feel really vulnerable or like very fragile and then be really worried or be kind of hopeless about their future. And then these are just some examples of things you might see in the intrusive symptoms. So rather than, I'm going to go back a little bit. So remember we gave examples of like flashbacks, dissociating, like intense prolonged distress, physiological reactivity after being exposed to the reminder. That in terms of kids might look more like their play. You may see that more manifested through play. So they might have repetitive trauma-related play. They might do drawings or stories rather than verbally report that they're having these intrusive symptoms about memories. And then same thing, it might come up in their dreams, and they may not know, of course, that it's trauma-related content in their dreams. And then this should say dissociative. Those symptoms we don't really see as commonly in children. And we already talked about this bullet point when we talked about schizophrenia. Just in general, dissociation we don't see as much in children. And then as far as arousal symptoms, just like mood and depression, really anger, irritability, and impulsivity are the things we see most often, rather than like hypervigilance or some of the other examples I gave. So because of that, it often gets mixed. This gets undetected in kids with PTSD. A lot of times people go more towards a mood disorder first, or they think it's an anxiety or a phobia about going to a specific place. And if there's trauma in that child's life, we might want to assess for PTSD. Okay, so that's the preschool subtype, and then some general features you're going to see in children across the board. PTSD also allows for a couple of specifiers. So you can say that it's with dissociative symptoms, and dissociative symptoms can either include depersonalization or derealization. And you can also specify whether there was a delayed expression. So I'll just talk about this last one. Delayed expression basically just is saying that the actual full diagnostic criteria, so everything we need to meet PTSD, that is not met until after at least 6 months after the event happened. So some people develop it right away, right? And the symptoms have endured for at least 1 month. That's what you need in order for PTSD diagnosis, but it can be occurring for more than that or less than that. So you need it at least 6 months after the event. If you're curious what the differences between depersonalization and derealization is, there's a little definition there. Not everyone who has PTSD dissociates, so that's why there's a specifier. Okay, so that's it for PTSD. I think something that is just nice to remember, and I kind of touched on this earlier I think on Monday when we talked about multifinality, is just this idea of post-traumatic stress symptoms, PTSS, is something that you see a lot in research. And this term is just referring to when the post-traumatic stress and interference with functioning is there, but it doesn't quite meet criteria for PTSD. So we would call that subthreshold. You can use that term for anything. So if someone meets criteria for, or maybe doesn't meet criteria for MDD, you might say that they're subclinical, they're subthreshold. But as far as PTSD terminology, PTSS is a term for it's there, the symptoms are there, but you haven't quite met the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. It's an important concept because number one, we see a lot of research with this. And number two, most youth who experience these post-traumatic stress symptoms will recover. It's more often that we see resilience and recovery in response to trauma than actual development of PTSD. So if there's a trauma, let's say in this child's life, and they start developing symptoms, but they don't quite have PTSD yet, they're experiencing post-traumatic stress symptoms. The idea that over time being they're probably growing out of it, or there's some resilience, protective factors that makes it so that their outcome does not become PTSD. It doesn't become some other psychopathology. There's a more adaptive, healthy outcome. And that all, again, just speaks to the idea of multifinality, where you can have the same stressor, you can have the same predisposition, whatever the case may be, could be same age, same sex. In this case, we're talking about same trauma, and each think of it as different like outcomes drawn to a line. So someone will end up with PTSD, someone will not, someone will end up with some other disorder. So this idea of PTSS is actually very consistent with what we've been talking about in terms of developmental psychopathology. And I think it gives people hope, especially parents, when they start to see these symptoms. This is probably a good time to get them into treatment to be more preventative so that it doesn't turn into PTSD, hopefully. Okay, so how do we treat it? So trauma-focused CBT is our evidence-based intervention for treating trauma in kids. It's multi-component. It's mainly for kids between 3 and 18 who have trauma-related symptoms. The intervention itself was originally developed for childhood sexual abuse, but has been used for multiple traumas that would count under Criterion A. And just like you see in Coping Cat or ERP with CBT for OCD, like pediatric OCD, it's going to have parent involvement, it's going to have child involvement, um, and then there's going to be some sort of conjoint session too. I'm going to skip the last bullet point just so you have a sense of what goes into TFCBT. So hopefully you see yourself. Okay, so the idea with TFCBT, and they have this acronym called PRACTICE, and this PRACTICE acronym is just laying out what the session structure is of the intervention. So P starts with psychoeducation and parenting skills, then you learn relaxation techniques, then affective expression and regulation, then cognitive coping and processing, then the trauma narration and processing, then in vivo exposure, then we have a joint parent-child session, and then enhancing personal safety and future growth. So if you'll notice, it gets gradually more intense in terms of dealing with the actual trauma. So all the way down here, in vivo is exposure and trauma narration, before we even get to talking about the actual traumatic event, before we actually have you do in vivo exposures, getting in the car or walking on the sidewalk, whatever the case may be. We are doing all of this stuff first to kind of give you resources and skills that are going to help you as you go through the rest of this stuff for the rest of the intervention. So it is kind of like a gradual exposure just by nature of the structure of TFCBT. So why do we need exposure? And again, this is why there is that overlap with anxiety and OCD at one point. Just going back, remember that the trauma narration processing is basically having the child write, or they can draw, or they can just say it and record it. It's basically saying what happened from start to finish. Depends on what like model you're using. A lot of times it's first person present tense. So I'm going to use the example of my teen who was in the car accident. It's I am in the car. It's hot out right now. My brother is loud in the back seat. Like it's present tense, future oriented. That's the actual trauma narration. And you're going to take like a SUDS level before, during the peak, and after, and then there's going to be some processing at the end. That's really intense, and you need a lot of buy-in, which is also why you need to do all this other stuff and rapport building before you even get there. And then the in vivo exposure is what are things functionally getting in the way of your life that you're perhaps not doing because of the trauma. So that's why we also pair it with in vivo exposure. The car accident person that I'm thinking of also had a more recent like hiking incident where she thought she was going to die, and there was her path was like she was like in the wilderness, and the path she had walked got like washed out with like really bad storm, and it like completely became a river. She thought she was going to die, and so she has a really hard time doing anything with water, like washing her face, washing her hands, washing her hair. And so our in vivo exposure has a lot to do with water. So anything related to the actual trauma. So why do we need that, whether it's the trauma narration or the exposure? Well, like anxiety, the avoidance of the negative feelings, thoughts, reminders, whatever that's associated with a traumatic event is negatively reinforced by temporary relief. So we keep avoiding, we're just amplifying the anxiety about it. And the avoidance is temporary relief, but it just gets negatively reinforced. So we're just amplifying this idea that I can't tolerate it. It's going to be really, really bad when I'm having to confront that anxiety or that traumatic reminder. That's very similar to anxiety. That's just like this system, like the cycle. But also in the context of trauma in particular, that trauma never gets consolidated. So we talk about trauma as being something that needs to be consolidated into your kind of like your life narrative, where it becomes it becomes part of your story, like becomes part of your life. And over time, as we get older, instead of becoming activated by this traumatic event, it just becomes consolidated. So like just as you might be able to look back and say, oh yeah, in third grade, I ran the marathon. In third grade, my parents got divorced. Like just as you can talk about that potentially with no activation, that's eventually how we hope the trauma gets consolidated. It's part of your life story and it's no longer associated with like any of the PTSD symptoms. So if we're avoiding it, we're never actually giving ourselves the opportunity to process it, resolve it, and integrate it into our life. And so developing the trauma narrative is one way of allowing us to do that, but we're doing it in a very safe environment. And because it's gradual, we're doing it in small doses. And so it helps the child approach rather than avoid. And again, over time, the idea is that it gets consolidated into the child's life. Okay, so here's my case study. I've already spoken to her a little bit about her. So she is a 17-year-old and she is now 18. So I started seeing her when she was 17. Immigrated to the US around age 6. And at the time, it was just her parents, and her brother, who was 2 years younger, and they had no other family in the US. As far as the trauma index that I was aware of when she came into therapy to see me was this fatal car accident that happened when she was around age 11, happened during a summer vacation when she returned to her home country. And in that accident was her little brother, and her grandfather. The little brother died on impact. The grandpa and my client were like injured. Um, Not terribly, but like needed to be hospitalized. Like I think, yeah, like I think there were clearly some concerns about like bodily injury. So the patient reported that after this happened, the girl was released from the hospital and they held a funeral in their hometown. Because remember, they're in their home country. So by the end of the summer, they have had this funeral and they're going to head back to the US and go about their life because they've moved there, but now it'll just be the child, my client, and her parents. So the patient reported that they never really discussed this event ever again after the funeral. It sounded like culturally, that's kind of the way that they were raised in their culture, and also like in terms of the family context, that's just how it is. We have the funeral, we have this religious sermon, and then that's it. We don't talk about it. So, and remember, she's a child, and so that's really hard. So, as far as like what was her treatment history, like did she ever see a therapist? So, she did immediately in the home country after being released from the hospital. So, she had to spend the rest of the summer in her home country. They were planning the funeral. She started seeing a psychiatrist and talked to them for like a couple months, but then had to go back to the US. Never saw someone until 4 years later, where she sought therapy because she was having panic attacks. Didn't really know what it was about, just I'm really dysregulated, I'm having panic attacks, like it's really debilitating. So she ended up seeing a therapist for like maybe 6 months to a year. In that time, and it was known to that therapist that she also had a very clear trauma in her life. It's clear that she had PTSD, but also some of these like panic attacks. So he diagnosed her with like generalized anxiety disorder and PTSD with panic attacks. What they did in treatment was just coping skills. So all that like relaxation training stuff I showed you in the TFCBT slide, that's pretty much what they did for 6 months, was just building rapport. Or I actually think they worked together for a year. Building rapport, here's how to do like progressive muscle relaxation, and like if you need to talk, basically very generalized, like more like counseling versus um psychotherapy from like a clinical psych lens. So that was it. But by the time I saw her, she was 17. So 2 years later, she came to see me, and it was clear that her PTSD symptoms had really spiked, and it was really, really interfering with something that she loved to do. And that was when she was like, okay, I really need to work on my PTSD. This is like really bad. I haven't seen a therapist in 2 years. And like the thing that I love to do, I can't do it. And it's like actually really upsetting. I do this thing 6 out of 7 days of the week. I can't do it. Like that's really messing with me. So over the course of treatment, something to note is I only knew about this car accident. And what was super interesting is, remember, it happened when she was 11 and she had gone through such long periods of not working on it or not talking about it or in spending in therapy, like basically avoiding the trauma stuff and only talking about relaxation skills. By the time I came to see her, she had already kind of brushed it under the rug and said, like, well, I actually don't remember many details about the car accident. It actually doesn't impact me today. Like, obviously, I know it's like a big deal, but it actually doesn't explain any of the stuff that I'm dealing with. I don't have none of those beliefs that you're talking about. Like, I don't experience any of that. Hypervigilance is adaptive. Like, I need to be like this because otherwise you're dumb if you're not safe in Houston. Okay, so that's fine. So clearly she has impairing symptoms, but she's very intellectual in terms of she's intellectualizing her symptoms. And she met diagnostic criteria for PTSD, but something that we were working with and where she was at is having very limited emotional awareness of what was happening for her. And what we were working against is that she didn't have any memory of the car accident or anything about her childhood. So if I would say, tell me about your brother, couldn't tell me anything about him. Um, Tell me about the things you did when you were 11. Like, did you like to get ice cream? Whatever. Can't tell you. Don't remember. I don't have access to that memory. Eventually, I learned, oh, actually, a year before I saw her, so either 15 or 16, sometime in between having that first therapist and me, she had gone home again for the summer. And that's when she had been in some sort of like hiking incident, like in this wilderness where I mentioned she thought she was going to die. The path got washed out, it became a river. And she just remembers being drenched and like just rain hitting her face. And she thought she was going to die. That's not very surprising that it escalated to, I think I'm going to die, I think I'm going to die, given she's had previous exposure. So it's really common once you have one exposure, it's just like research shows like it's very common to have been exposed to cumulative exposure. And even if this was not a real instance where she's going to die, that was her belief. Like she genuinely thought that was it for her. She was never going to see her parents again, anything like that. This is the thing that she was like, this is impairing. This is the thing that like this is why I'm here. Like I'm getting tunnel vision. I had to stop going to that activity that I mentioned because it reminded me, I keep getting flashbacks of that thing. I have water hitting my face. It's super impairing. And so things like washing her hands, drinking water, brushing her teeth, taking a shower, anytime it rained in Houston or it's thundering, anytime she had to walk home in the rain, like could not do that. Like was very dysregulated, symptoms would go up for her. So we ended up pivoting because although there were two traumas, this is the thing that she endorses as being most impairing. And it's also the thing that I had the most buy-in to work on. So we pivoted. We said, okay, we're going to work on the hiking incident first. And then actually, let's see what happens from there. And then if it's okay, we can process the car accident. So for 2 months, so 8 sessions, we did our imaginal exposures, which was the trauma narrative, and we assessed her SUDS. We talked about specific emotions and then any insight she gained after each trauma exposure. So for 8 weeks, just repeatedly repeat the same story, repeat the same story. And we kind of got it shorter and shorter to like the hot spot, like the thing that caused her the most distress. But that's what we did over and over and over. And you would be surprised, her insight was actually like really amazing. Like her insight grew, she had certain realizations. So really like powerful. And then in the current month, we're now working on in vivo exposure. So like washing your hands. And actually what's so interesting is now that we've been doing this trauma narrative, we ended up separating trauma narrative from in vivo. Sometimes people will do trauma narrative in the session and they'll assign for homework the in vivo exposure. She didn't want to do that, so we separated it. And now we're kind of just doing an in vivo exposure just to ensure that like we've actually extinguished the fear. But we developed a hierarchy with all those things I mentioned, washing your hair, washing your whatever, brushing your teeth, drinking water, and like none of it is distressing. She does it every day now, like without any problem, without any fear. When a year ago when I saw her, there was a month straight where she wasn't brushing her teeth. She just used mouthwash. She literally was not washing her hair, so she washed it like once a month and said, well, dry shampoo is fine. She took a wet cloth to wash her face instead of putting water on her face. Couldn't take a shower, so like would just use body wipes. Like pretty like functionally debilitating for like 4 to 6 weeks. And now when I'm seeing her after doing all this trauma narrative stuff, living her life very functionally, doing all the things she couldn't do before. So that's where we're at now. And she's very excited to now move on to this car accident. And we'll just repeat the process now with the trauma narrative and the in vivo exposures. Okay, so that's it for the case study. That's all I want to say about PTSD. Um, Looking at the time, I just want to ask, are there any questions about that? I know we have like 3 more slides, I think, and then we'll be done with the lecture, but any slides, or sorry, any questions before I move on? Questions or comments? I'm gonna stop sharing for 1 second just to see if okay, so I saw a question, so they could be called triggers. I probably missed what this was in reference to. I mean, I guess it was the question was related to like cues, any reminders. Yeah, triggers, you could use that word. Um, in therapy, I try not to use the word trigger. I think that's just another something about PTSD and trauma. Unfortunately, there's so much of it, which is why there's so much discourse online and, social media. But the words that get used all the time are trauma and trigger. And so it actually gets confusing in therapy when the client is referring to something that is not actually a trauma or trigger. And so, yeah, we'll use like, what's the reminder? What's the cue? But yeah, you could call that a trigger, like a trauma trigger. Okay, I'm going to go back to the screen. All right, so we'll end with these other two. So reactive attachment disorder and disinhibited social engagement disorder are two child-based disorders within the PTSD trauma-related stressor disorders section. Excuse me. These are considered attachment disorders, and they're only diagnosed in children between 0 to 6 years of age. And even then, the child needs to at least have a developmental age of at least 9 months. For either of these disorders, it must be established that the child has experienced extremes of insufficient care, which is going to look like one of the following or more: persistent lack of having caregivers to provide for your basic needs, repeated changes of the primary caregivers, which limits your ability to form stable attachment, and then rearing in unusual situations, which also limits the opportunity to form stable attachments. So you're really going to see this, like this unusual situation. Like if you remember the Bucharest Early Intervention Project we talked about weeks ago when we talked about attachment and um, yeah, rearing and sensitive periods, like that's an example of an unusual situation where probably a lot of those children had one of these disorders, most likely. So this must be true in order to even look at reactive attachment disorder or disinhibited social engagement disorder. Quick caveat, because you'll notice I put a little asterisk next to attachment disorders. Note that these are developmental attachment disorders in terms of like this is thought of as it's called literally an attachment disorder. It's in the DSM and it's intended for younger kids. Just remember though that that's separate from when we talked about attachment just in general, like forming stable attachment and insecure attachment. That in general, like attachment difficulties is going to be considered a risk factor for all psychopathology, and it's implicated in most disorders. So it's a transdiagnostic risk factor. Um, so I point this out because attachment is not only relevant for just these two disorders, it's just these are the only two that have the name that it's associated as an attachment disorder. Okay, quickly, let's look at what's the difference. So reactive attachment, or you might hear RAD. This is to describe kids who display extremely underdeveloped attachment to their adult caregivers. So they might be really withdrawn from their caregiver. They might be like socially and emotionally, maybe unresponsive. When they're distressed, they don't see comfort from from the caregiver. It's oftentimes when you hear like foster parents or adoptees or adoptive parents talk about like there's just something like there's no connection here. And again, they're little. It often has something to do with like reactive attachment disorder. Like think that level of extreme. And then disinhibited is really about indiscriminate attachment. Like now it's the opposite. It's like no filter. It's like I will go to anybody and might be overly familiar towards the stranger. And it's beyond that of what is culturally acceptable. So you can imagine like that can be pretty scary for a parent, or let's say a foster parent or a new adoptive parent, because the child is less likely to be inhibited. They're not scared of going off with this person that is a stranger to them. So this one can be pretty scary for parents. Okay, and then the last slide. So remember I said I wasn't talking a bit about acute stress disorder. I would lightly touch on adjustment disorder. So this one, here's the diagnostic criteria. Just look at criterion A, development of emotional and behavioral symptoms in response to an identifiable stressor occurring within 3 months of the onset of the stressor. I'll point this out that I think adjustment disorder, as far as a label, is often given when people or clinicians are confused, like, okay, this person doesn't meet criteria for PTSD, like all the symptom clusters that they need to endorse, it's not looking like what this person has. And so oftentimes I'll see like that person be diagnosed with adjustment disorder. Um, and it might be for like because people will do therapy and they'll try to use their insurance, and insurance you have to give a diagnostic code in order for them to reimburse reimburse the person's bill. And so the diagnosis code I've seen really often being used as adjustment disorder if it's not PTSD and if it doesn't meet criteria for any of these other things. But just for your knowledge, I think adjustment disorder is actually something very commonly seen. The one kid that I worked with, like, I've seen this in the context of divorce. So, like, all those things that don't count as PTSD criterion A, you might consider it over here under an adjustment disorder, if it fits. So that's just, it's like, where does it go then if criterion A trauma doesn't count for your situation? Well, it might be over here under adjustment disorder because that could be the stressor that's um, identified here under this particular criterion. Okay, we have like, it's exactly 10. So just a reminder, we will not meet on Friday, but if it's possible and anyone has ideas, so next week is entirely just like a professional development week. It's literally use it however you want. So like I have an idea of what I want to do. Just I know some people are actually a lot of people seemed interested in grad school. So I generally was just going to talk about I don't know, my grad school experience or like answer any questions. I'm also going to have, I asked my friend to please, and my colleague to please come in. So she's going to come in on Wednesday. Again, it's professional development. So she'll talk a little bit about like public health and psychology, like how those things can blend together. Because you don't always just have to be a therapist or a researcher if you're interested in psychology after undergrad. So I guess what I'm asking of you all is just email me like ideas if there's anything you think would be interesting to hear. Or if you don't email, just be thinking about it because otherwise next week's going to be boring because we have 3 full days dedicated to talking about grad school or jobs or whatever you guys are interested in. Does that sound okay? Do you think you'll be able to think of some things that'll be helpful for the rest? Yeah, okay. And I had talked to someone else during office hours. There are also no stupid questions. So even if it's like, what can you do with a psychology degree? Like that's not a stupid question. Do all programs require the GRE? Yeah, the GRE, not a stupid question. So any questions you have, think about it and let me know. And then if I can prepare anything before that, I will. Otherwise, just unmute and ask questions next week. All right. I will see you guys on Monday.